Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 358. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of news to get to on today's show, but first I want to remind everyone it's fundraising time at the Libertarian Institute. So if you'd like to support, the team in the liberty movement that's doing the most important foreign policy work, please head on over to the Libertarian Institute. Of course, Scott Horn runs the thing. We have Sheldon Richmond, James Bovard, Laura Calhoun writing weekly articles for us. Myself, Will Porter, Connor Freeman work on the news team, Patrick McFarlane, and a lot of other great people over at the Institute. So head on over and check that out. You can also just support the show by sharing it. Again, everything's at the Institute. We repost the show on antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee for the video version of the show. But just putting it out there any way you can is always helpful. And with that, and the sponsor of the show is Paloma Verde, PalomaVerdeCBD.com. The promo code is PEACE. That's going to save you 20% off when you spend $75 or more. Now let's get into the show. The first article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on Sunday, December 4th. A former standout agent at the Drug Enforcement Agency, Jose Izari, says the police force knows the drug war is unwinnable in an interview with the Miami Herald. The former agent claimed that a group of agents calling themselves Team America are using their power for profit. Previously known as a top officer of the DEA, Izare was sentenced to more than 12 years in prison last December for operating a money laundering and fraud scheme while serving as a special agent. In comments to the Associated Press last week, he accepted his guilt and claimed his criminal behavior was rampant at the federal agency. We had free assets to do whatever we wanted. We would generate money, pickups in places we wanted to go, and once we got there, it was about drinking and girls. The drug war as a game is a fun game that we are playing a part of. He alleged that other agents joined him in exploiting their authority to extend exclusive events, go to strip clubs, and hire prostitutes. While the DEA denies his accusations, the DOJ has now conducted several interviews and appears to be taking his claims seriously. Additionally, the judge that sentenced the former DEA agent called for an inquiry into his colleagues. Bonnie Clapper, a former federal prosecutor, told the Miami Herald the DEA has very little oversight over its agents as they launder millions of dollars for the drug cartels, which the agency often does in hopes of making arrests. However, Izare said many DEA agents use the money laundering operations to create their own slush funds. He claimed that for him and for his friends, it was mostly about drinking and girls. He added that agents know the drug war is unwinnable and their goal is to profit as much as possible. He went on to tell the Herald that a group of agents that he was a part of called themselves Team America and learned how to abuse the system while being considered top agents. We know the game. We know the DEA was about stats. Everyone was happy all around. So, very disturbing here that we get the war on drugs, which takes so much of the American budget and police force and time. Our jails are filled with people who are caught up in the drug war, and the DEA agents themselves knows that this is unwinnable. So next up, I want to move on and briefly mention this. I'm not going to go into as much detail. A lot of people are doing, big episodes on this, but I feel like this is confirmation of what, everybody who listens to the show already knew and what I already said. Although, Matt Taibbi reporting this with the actual documents is important. So we have the Twitter files here, and Sheer Post put this together. Journalist Matt Taibbi reported a massive scoop regarding Twitter's internal handling of Hunter Biden's laptop story in a long Twitter thread on December 2nd after receiving documents from Elon Musk. And so what he says is, what you're about to read is the first installment of a series based upon thousands of internal documents obtained by sources at Twitter. The Twitter files tells an incredible story from inside of one of the world's largest and most influential social media platforms. It is a Frankenstein tale of a human-built mechanism growing out of control of its designer. Twitter, in its conception, was a brilliant tool for enabling instant mass communication, making true real-time global communication communications possible for the first time. In an early conception, Twitter more than lived up to its mission statement, giving people the power to create and share ideas, information instantly without barriers. As time progressed, however, the company was slowly forced to add those barriers. Some of the first tools for controlling speech were designed to combat the likes of spam and financial fraudsters. Slowly over time, Twitter staff and executives began to find more and more uses for these tools. Outsiders began petitioning the company to manipulate speech as well, first a little, more often than consistently. By 2020, requests for connected actors to delete tweets were routine. One executive would write to another, more to review from the Biden team, then reply back, handled. Celebrities and unknowns alike could be removed or reviewed at the behest of a political party. Both parties had access to these tools. For instance, in 2020, requests from both the Trump White House and the Biden campaign were received and honored. However, this system wasn't balanced. It was based on contacts because Twitter was and is overwhelmingly staffed by people of one political orientation. There were more channels, more ways to complain, more open to the left, well, Democrats, than the right. And, the left-right whole thing doesn't work, but I think Matt's just trying to use the general term. He goes on to say the resulting slant in content moderation decisions is visible in the documents you're about to read. However, it is also the assessment of multiple current and former high-level executives. The Twitter Files Part 1, How and Why Twitter Blocked the Hunter Biden Laptop Story. On October 14th, 2020, the New York Post published Biden's secret emails, an expose based on contents from Hunter Biden's abandoned laptop. Twitter took extraordinary steps to suppress the story by removing links and posting warnings that it may be unsafe. They even blocked transmissions via the direct messaging, a tool hitherto reserved for extreme cases like child pornography. And this was something that, obviously I had never experienced, or, this was something like, I think it was myself and Joanne Leone, the host of Around the Empire, both tried to send this article back and forth to each other to see, are they really blocking direct messages here? And they were. I believe we were able to get around it by making an archive of it. By the way, everybody, archive.s is a fantastic tool for bypassing paywalls. New York Times, Washington Post, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, wherever you got it, go to archive.today, archive.is, and throw the link in there and it'll get you around the paywall. It'll also can be helpful in bypassing this kind of thing. So let's say you want to post RT article on Twitter or Facebook, or article of TASS, the Russian, it's the Russian Voice of America, it's the Russian official propaganda outlet, right? Is they put out official press releases through their TASS news agency, and if you want to put something like that out, if you use the archive, you get less, I think, of the algorithmic downvoting and things like that of your articles. So White House spokesperson Kayleigh McEnany was locked out of her account for tweeting about the story, prompting a furious letter from the Trump campaign staffer Mark Kahn, who seethed, at least pretend to care for the next 20 days. This led public policy executive Caroline Storm to send out a polite WTF inquiry. Several employees noted that there were tensions between the comms and policy team, who had a little and less control over moderation than the safety trust teams. Storm's note returned the answer that the laptop story had been removed for a violation of the company's hacked material policy. Although several sources recalled hearing a general warning from federal law enforcement that some are about possible foreign hacks, there is no evidence that I've seen, and again, this is Matt Taibbi's tweeting, of any government involvement in the laptop story. In fact, that might have been the problem. The decision was made at the highest levels of the company without the knowledge of CEO Jack Dorsey, with the former head of legal and policy trust, Vijay Gradle, playing a key role. They just freelanced it, is how one former employee characterized the decision. Hacking was the excuse, but within a few hours, pretty much everyone realized that it wasn't going to hold, but no one had the guts to reverse it. You can see the confusion in the following lengthy exchange, which ends up including a tweet from that Trust and Safety Chief and comms official Trenton Kennedy, who writes, "I'm struggling to understand the policy basis for marking this unsafe." By this point, everybody knew this was effed, one former employee said, but the response was essentially to err on the side of continuing to err. One former VP of Global Comms, Brandon Borman, asked, "Can we truthfully claim at this is part of the policy?" To which former Deputy Counsel Jim Baker again seems to advise staying the non-course because caution is warranted. A fundamental problem with tech companies and content moderation, many people in charge of speech care little about speech and have been told the basics by outsiders. To writ, in one humorous exchange on day one, Democrat Congressman Ro Khanna reached out to the Twitter executive to gently suggest she had hop on the phone to talk about the backlash regards to speech. Khanna was the only Democratic official I could find in the files who expressed concern. So, one of the reasons this is important is, of course, there's no evidence at all that that was a hack, and it seems pretty clear that it wasn't, that Hunter Biden was just, a drug addict who left his laptop at a repair shop, and that's how this got out. And look, whatever implications it may have had on the election, I think it's really disturbing how quickly this story was suppressed. And look, I think for a lot of Trump people, when Trump said that the election was rigged, it sounded right to them, right? Because this happened and everybody knew this happened. And everybody knows that if you're covering up an explosive story about a candidate a few days before the election, it's going to have an impact on that election. And look, there's the Time Magazine story that myself and Joanne Leone reviewed just days after the election. They put this out, I guess it was probably a month or so after the election, where they openly say that they did this. That, they say an elite cabal worked to make sure Joe Biden won the election, and one of the tools that they used was censorship and things like this. And so I think a lot of people felt that that was right. But of course, his, at least as far as I've ever seen, he hasn't proved any of the claims that Trump was actually making. And so you had a whole bunch of people who felt like Trump was right, but, ended up being wrong because he led them down the wrong path ultimately. When I think if, he had focused on the actual problems, like, the suppression of not free speech, but the suppression of this particular story, and then just all other kinds of censorship that happened in the run up to the election, he would have been making, first of all, reasonable points, but then, maybe, more reforms would happen more quickly on these platforms. But, obviously that's not the path Trump took. All right, now let's move on to some Russian news here. First story I have is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Pretty big deal here. Explosions hit airbase deep inside Russia, killing 3 soldiers. Explosions hit 2 Russian air bases deep inside Russian territory early Monday morning, killing 3 Russian soldiers and damaging 2 aircraft, the Russian Defense Ministry said. Blasts were reported at the I'm not going to even try to pronounce these 2 airfields but they are both over 250 miles from the Ukrainian border. The Russian Defense Ministry said the attacks were carried out by a number of Ukrainian drones. Kiev hasn't officially taken credit for the attack, but an anonymous senior Ukrainian official speaking with the New York Times said Ukrainian forces were responsible. The official said the drones were launched from Ukrainian territory and claimed the strike was made with help from Ukrainian special forces inside of Russia. The Times reported that the Engels airfield houses some of Russia's long-range nuclear-capable bombers. Drone attacks have been reported throughout the war in Russian regions near the Ukrainian border, but the incident Monday is significantly further inside Russia than previous attacks. Following the attacks on the 2 air bases, Russia launched another barrage of missile strikes targeting energy infrastructure in Ukraine, putting more pressure on Ukraine its already decimated power grid. Russian strikes targeted major Ukrainian cities, including Kiev and Odessa. According to South Front, the strikes left Sumy and other regions of Ukraine without power, and partial blackouts were reported in Kharkiv, Zhytomyr, and Odessa regions. The Russian defense ministry described the missile barrage as a massive strike on Ukraine's infrastructure and said all 17 assigned objectives were hit. Russia did not launch large-scale attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure until after the October Trump bombing on the Kerch Bridge, which connects Crimea to the Russian mainland. Russian attacks on energy infrastructure have left Ukrainian civilians in a dire situation as millions are without power and heat and water. Ukraine is struggling to repair its power grid and is looking to the U.S. and other Western backers for support. So that's a really important story, and really, I think concerning, especially given that Russia may view this as an attack on its strategic infrastructure. Interesting what the response is going to be over the course of this week. My guess is it's not just going to be the response on Monday, but we're going to continue to see barrages of missiles hit Ukraine and take out more infrastructure. Now, this is a really interesting story, really important here, I think. Wall Street Journal, U.S. secretly limited the range of weapons sent to Ukraine. The Department of Defense secretly altered the most advanced weapon systems the U.S. has transferred to Ukraine. The change prevented the platform from firing long-range munitions, according to the Wall Street Journal. The White House has sent 20 high-mobility artillery rocket systems, HIMARS, to Ukraine over the past 6 months, out of a total of 38 authorized for Kiev. Without telling their Ukrainian counterparts, the Pentagon outfitted the systems with a component to prevent them from firing munitions with a range of over 50 miles. President Joe Biden has sent thousands of guided multiple launch rocket systems, GLMRS rockets, to Ukraine, and those have a range of about 50 miles. However, Kiev has repeatedly asked for the longer range Army Tactical Missile Systems, ATACMS, which can strike targets nearly 200 miles away. Both munitions can be fired from the HIMARS platform. The Biden administration has said it will not transfer rockets with a range of longer than 50 miles out of concerns the munitions will be used for attacks on Russian soil. Ukraine has offered the White House control over selecting targets in an effort to alleviate U.S. concerns, but Washington has apparently not been willing to budge on the issue. The Journal spoke with an American official who said the Biden administration fears that sending longer-range munitions will escalate the war. Some NATO members, such as Latvia, have disagreed with the Biden administration's decision and have urged him to supply the weapons, arguing it is unwise to let Russia determine Western policies. We should allow the Ukrainians to use weapons to target missiles, sites, or airfields from where those operations are being launched, the Latvian foreign minister said on the sidelines of the NATO summit last week, adding that allies should not fear retaliation by Moscow. Additionally, a U.S. official said the modifications on the HIMARS indicate distrust between Washington and Kiev. The alterations reflect apprehension among administration officials that their Ukrainian partner might not stop keeping its promise not to strike Russian territory with U.S. provided weapons, the Journal added. So I think two important parts of this story. One is timing. It's interesting that this comes right after that strike deep inside Russian territory. And you wonder if maybe the White House is looking to reassure the Kremlin that, we're not necessarily authorizing this kind of behavior from Kiev. At the same time, maybe another, it doesn't have anything to do with that because the timing was really bad to bad. So if it would have been the White House apprehensive that Kiev was going to carry this out and then went ahead and gave these weapons or gave this story to the Wall Street Journal in advance, hoping it would come out around the same time, which ends up happening. So that is a possibility. I think another, really important point here is that, this does really seem to reflect distrust between the White House and Zelensky. As I really don't think Ukraine knew about these because they've been demanding the longer range rockets this whole time, which apparently their HIMARS can't even fire. Next up, story by Dave Camp from December 5th. U.S. Army plans dramatic increase in ammunition production as Ukraine aid drains stockpiles. The U.S. Army is planning a dramatic increase in the production of 155 millimeter artillery rounds as the U.S. has sent a staggering amount of ammunition to Ukraine over the past 8 months. According to the Pentagon fact sheet released at the end of November, the U.S. sent Ukraine nearly 1 million rounds of 155 millimeter artillery rounds to Kiev since February 24th. The U.S. currently mates about 14,000 155 millimeter rounds each month, and so obviously it would take many years to restock the U.S. Supplies at that rate. Dave DeCamp had a fantastic tweet earlier this week, and I don't know if these 155 millimeter rounds, I think they're maybe made by General Dynamics and some other companies, but in general, you have a situation for many of these arms makers, but particularly Raytheon, where I guess it just so happens the Secretary of Defense used to work, where they now don't have really limits. They could produce as many weapons as possible, and that there's just a backlog of years and years and years of people wanting to buy. So the official at the Department of Defense said that the plan will use aid that has already been authorized for Ukraine, but will require new funding. That's a part of the $37.7 billion aid package the White House asked Congress to approve. And so there's no doubt in my mind that will get approved. Now, one of the consequences of this is where are all these weapons going to end up? Not all are going to be used on the Ukrainian battlefield, maybe not even most. Nigerian president says weapons from Ukraine are winding up in Africa. Nigeria's president has warned that weapons and ammunition used in the war in Ukraine are winding up in the hands of terrorists in the Lake Chad region of Africa. And this is the Sahel region that I've covered a lot on the show, more in 2021, 2020, but I've covered a lot: Libya, Chad, Burkina Faso, Mali, all these countries in this region that have been subject to an enormous amount of insurgency and terrorism, in part as kind of leftover blowback from the war in Libya, but also just from the French intervention in Mali and all the other little things the U.S. is doing, like with its 127 Echo program. So the Nigerian president made the comments last week from the capital city. According to a press release from his office, he drew attention to the increased number of arms, ammunition, other weapons from the Russia and Ukrainian war in the Lake Chad Basin. He said that the weapons were also coming from other areas in Africa's Sahel region, from fighting in Libya. Regrettably, the situation in the Sahel and the raging war in Ukraine serve as major sources of weapons and fighters that bolster the reigns of terrorists in the Lake Chad region. Now, I guess the only other thing I'll say, just a little qualification before I move on here, not saying that he's making this up, and I'm sure weapons are bleeding out of the battlefield, but I do know the security situation in Nigeria is pretty rough, so there's always the possibility that this could be, a little bit of trying to misappropriate the blame for this on the president's part, but all the same, I'm sure there are already starting to get to be some of those weapons bleeding into these areas of Africa, which really aren't that far from Ukraine. Growing number of Americans want Washington to press for peace in Ukraine. I wrote this for the Libertarian Institute on December 5th. A new survey indicates American support for Kiev is slipping. According to polling conducted by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, the number of citizens who want the White House to pursue a diplomatic path is nearly equal to those who advocate indefinite military aid to Ukraine. The survey shows a declining number of Republicans who want to give military assistance to Kiev, carrying on a 6-month trend. Global Affairs polling in March found that 80% of GOP-leaning respondents wanted the White House to arm Ukraine. That number declined to 64% in July and was down to 55% in the latest poll that was released on Sunday, although I believe was conducted about 2 weeks ago. Democrat support has also dropped, though at a slower pace. Additionally, the results show waning approval for Joe Biden's policy regarding the war in Ukraine. The U.S. and its NATO partners have committed to providing the country with military aid for as long as it needs to win the war, all the while urging Kiev not to negotiate with Moscow. However, the new polling indicates that only 48% of Americans agree with arming Ukraine indefinitely. That figure is down by 10% since July, with the number of citizens urging for long-term military assistance now nearly equal to those who want Biden to push Ukrainian President Zelensky to talk with his Russian counterpart Putin. The vast majority of Americans continue to oppose direct military involvement in the war, with only 32% of respondents saying they want troops deployed to Ukraine. Although a third of Americans is still kind of a scary number for, supporting direct war with Russia. While some taxpayers may be growing tired of paying for massive aid shipments to Kiev, nearly 3/4 of people want responding to the poll said they want to continue Western economic war on Russia despite the impact sanctions might have, including skyrocketing inflation in the U.S. and soaring fuel prices in Europe. So, it's not that the U.S., I think, is really pushing for peace talks here, even though there's, been some talk in the White House about maybe softening that stance in recent months. I really don't think the Joe Biden administration is interested in all. However, there are European leaders who are, including French President Emmanuel Macron. This is from Aide de Camp on December 4th. The French president has said that Russia's security concerns when it comes to NATO expansion need to be taken into account in any future peace talks, and that the West needs to be prepared to give Moscow guarantees. We need to be prepared what we are ready to do, how we are to protect our allies and member states, and how to give guarantees to Russia the day it returns to the negotiating table, the French leader said in an interview that aired on Sunday. One of the essential points we must address, as President Putin has always said, is the fear that NATO comes right up to its doors and the deployments of weapons that could threaten Russia. Any future peace deal between Russia and Ukraine would require a guarantee that Kiev will remain neutral and won't join NATO. Russia has made that demand leading up to its invasion, but the U.S. refused to make the promise. Last week, NATO doubled down on its pledge that Ukraine will eventually join the alliance. Macron's comments drew angry response from Ukraine. An advisor to President Zelensky said guarantees for Moscow would make it impossible after tribunal convictions of war authors and war criminals and the imposition of large-scale reparations. So, Ukraine saying they're not interested in this at all. The U.S. says that they're only interested in talks that the Ukrainians sign off on. So I have no belief here that the U.S. is at all interested in talks. A quick follow-up to a story that I covered on Sunday's show and wrote last week for antiwar.com. Ukraine hits Russian Orthodox clerics with sanctions. Kiev has imposed sanctions on 10 top clerics in the Russian Orthodox Church, a move that comes after President Zelensky announced he was seeking to ban the religion and any religion with ties to the Russian Federation from operating in Ukraine. Ukraine's security services issued a statement on Sunday that announced penalties for 10 senior members of the Russian Orthodox Church, alleging the clerics were working with Moscow. The security services of Ukraine continue to carry out comprehensive work on the protection of Ukrainian statehood and will continue to expose persons who threaten the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, the statement said. The measures are unlikely to have a major impact, as all the sanctioned religious figures are currently in Russian-controlled territory or Russia, but the sanctions are nonetheless a part of a broader effort to purge the Russian culture from Ukraine. In his nightly address on Thursday, Zelensky said it was necessary to ban all religious organizations with ties to Russia, insisting that the country must never allow anyone to build an empire inside Ukraine's soul. The number of Ukrainians who practice Russian Orthodox in Russian Orthodox parishes is unclear. Some recent polling places the number as low as 15%, but those surveys did not consult Ukrainians living in Russian-held territory. Zelensky has vowed to retake all of Ukraine, suggesting millions of people living in the Donbass and Crimea could lose their ability to worship if those regions are retaken by Kiev. And I know it's very unlikely that those regions will be retaken, but that is what the U.S. is supporting right now, retaking regions that will see a huge number of the people who live there have their religions outlawed if that happens. That makes me think that those people will fight pretty vigorously to make sure that they're not reabsorbed by Ukraine. So the price cap has come into effect. An EU embargo on Russian oil and a Western imposed price cap on Russian oil came into effect on Monday, as Moscow says preparing a response to those policies. The US-led push to impose a price cap on Russian oil, and the EU agreed to set it at $60 per barrel, or at least 5% below market value. The EU embargo on Russian oil also prohibits issuing insurance for all Russian oil shipments unless the crude is sold at or below the cap. When asked to how Russia will respond, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said, "The decision is being prepared. One thing is obvious, we will not recognize any of the price caps." Now, Ukraine was irate with these price caps. They said that the number should have been about $30 per barrel or half of this. And so I'm not sure what Russia is going to do, because I think it was a pretty minor decision. Now, I don't think in any way Russia is prepared to go along with these price caps, but they may not have a major reaction, seeing that, the Europeans probably took the most minimal pass forward once they had already decided they were putting on the price cap. Turkey expects more extraditions from Sweden for NATO membership. Sweden last week extradited a suspected member of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, to Turkey, a move Turkish officials have welcomed, but say Ankara wants to see more extraditions before approving Stockholm's NATO membership. And remember, I predicted this as soon as they started talking about NATO membership for Finland and Sweden. I said, look, just like every U.S.-American war policy, the Kurds are going to end up paying the price. And here we see it that even though I think it was like in June, the Swedish government only held together after they promised a Kurdish member of their parliament that they wouldn't move forward with these kind of steps. We now see them moving forward with these kind of steps, and it looks like they will be joining NATO, I would guess, in the coming year. My sense is that if they're already starting to issue these extraditions, they'll go through and meet Ankara's demands and then eventually receive entrance into the alliance. All right, everybody, that's where I'm wrapping up the show today. Thank you so much for tuning in. And if you could, please head on over to the Libertarian Institute and make a donation. libertarianinstitute.org/donates. We got a bunch of great kit bats for all of you there. But, mostly supports, because we do great work every day. Thanks, everyone.